The view that the human being is destined to become a wholly independent, free individuality seems to be contradicted by the fact that he exists as a member of a natural whole, race, tribe, nation, family, male or female, and that he acts within a whole, state, church, and so on. He exhibits the general characteristics of the group to which he belongs, and what he does is determined by the place he occupies within a community. Given all this, is individuality still possible? Can we regard the individual human being as a whole in himself, seeing that he grows out of one whole and fits in as a member of another? The characteristics and function of each member of a whole are defined by the whole. An ethnic group is a whole, and the members belonging to it exhibit characteristic traits that are determined by the nature of the group. How the single member is constituted and his general behavior will be characteristic of the ethnic group to which he belongs. This is why the physiognomy and behavior of the individual has a typical quality. If we ask why a particular thing about a person is like this or like that, we are directed away from the individual person and toward his group type. The type is used to explain why something in the individual appears in the form we observe. However, the human being frees himself from these typical characteristics. He develops his own traits and roles for reasons that can only be found in himself. What is typical in him serves only as a means to develop his own individual nature. He uses the characteristic traits given by nature as a basis and gives them a form that expresses his own individuality. If we look to the laws of type to explain the individual aspect of a human being, we will seek in vain. We are dealing here with something completely individual that cannot be explained by something else. If a person has advanced to the point of emancipation from what is typical in him, and we still want to explain everything about him in terms of type, then we have no sense for what is individual. It is impossible to completely understand a human being if one's judgment is based on concepts of the type. The tendency to judge according to type is most persistent where differences of sex are involved. Man sees in woman and woman in man nearly always too much of the general characteristics of the other sex, and too little of what is individual in the other. Positions in society are not always determined by the individual characteristics of each person, but by the general ideas of what is considered the natural role and needs of a man or woman. Our activity in life should be determined by our individual abilities and inclinations, not solely by the fact of being a man or woman. Neither man or woman should be the slave of the typical, of the general idea of manhood or womanhood. As long as men debate whether women are suited to this or that profession according to their natural disposition, no progress will be made on the so-called women's question. What women are capable of according to their nature should be left for women to decide. If it is true that women are only suited to the professions that they are now in, then they will hardly have it in them to attain others on their own. But they must be allowed to decide for themselves what is appropriate to their nature. To all who fear a social upheaval, should women be treated as individuals and not as specimens of their sex, we need only reply that a social structure in which the status of one half of humanity is unworthy of the dignity of a human being is in great need of improvement. Whoever judges people according to their typical characteristics stops short at the boundary line beyond which people begin to be individuals, whose activity is based on free self-determination. What lies below this boundary line can naturally become the subject of academic study. The typical characteristics of race, ethnicity, nation, and sex are the subjects of specific branches of study. Only people who wish to live as nothing more than an example of a type could possibly fit the general picture that emerges from this kind of academic study. None of these branches of study are able to reach the unique character of the single individual. Determining the individual according to the laws of his type ends where the region of freedom in thinking and acting begins. In order to have the full reality, the human being connects his conceptual content with perception by means of thinking. No one can establish this conceptual content once and for all and hand it down to humanity in a finished form. Each individual must gain his concepts through his own intuition. How an individual is to think cannot be derived from some general concept of a type. It depends entirely on the individual himself. Nor are general human traits any indication of what concrete goals an individual will choose to pursue. Anyone who wishes to understand the single individuality must find his way to the innermost core of his particular being, and not stop short at the level of typical characteristics. In this sense, each human being is a separate challenge. And every kind of study that concerns itself with abstract thoughts and general concepts of the type is only a preparation for the knowledge we gain when an individuality tells us his way of viewing the world, and preparation for the knowledge we gain from the content of his acts of will. Whenever we feel we are dealing with a person who is free of the stereotypical thinking and instinctive willing of a type, we must refrain from calling up any of our mind's preconceptions if we want to understand him. Knowledge consists in combining concepts with the perception by means of thinking. In the case of everything else, the observer gains his concepts through his intuition. But if we are to understand a free individuality, we must receive into our mind those concepts by which he defines himself, in their pure form, without mixing in our own conceptual content. Those who immediately mix their own concepts into every judgment of others can never reach an understanding of an individuality. Just as the free individuality emancipates himself from typical characteristics, so must our method of knowing an individual emancipate itself from the method used to understand type. A person can be considered a free spirit within a community only to the extent he has emancipated himself from the characteristic traits of his type. No human being is all type, none is all individuality. But every person gradually emancipates a greater or lesser part of his being from the animal-like life of the species and from the controlling decrees of human authorities. In the part of his nature where he is unable to win this freedom, he remains a member incorporated into the natural and social organism. In this regard, he lives by imitating others or by obeying their commands. Only the part of his conduct that springs from his intuitions has ethical value in the true sense. This is his contribution to the already existing total of moral ideas. All moral activity of humanity has its source in individual ethical intuitions. One can say that the moral life of humanity is the sum total of what free human individuals have produced through their moral imagination. This is the creed of monism. Monism does not look upon the history of moral life as the education of the human race by a transcendent God, but as the gradual living out in practice of all concepts and ideas that spring from the moral imagination.